Good evening, Chag Sameach, and welcome. My name is Bren Carlil, and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Tonight, we will be speaking with Arnold Roth. Before I introduce Arnold, I want to let you know that we won't be having a lockdown learning conversation next Wednesday. However, on Tuesday, the 13th of October, we are delighted in coordination with Young UIA, Birthright Israel and Masa Israel Journey, to co-sponsor an event that will introduce you to a new way of advocating for Israel. This app is essentially a crowdsource app to harness the power of individuals in a city, in a country, or around the world to challenge anti-Semitism or unfair criticism of Israel wherever we see it. We will, of course, send you information about this event in due course. Our next lockdown learning conversation will be on Sunday, the 18th of October. And of course, if you follow us on Facebook or Twitter, you'll see plenty of other material of interest, as well as links to all our events. Yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the start of the Second Intifada. For those with long memories, you'll remember that in July 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered a state to Yasser Arafat at Camp David. Arafat said no, but 7 weeks later, his true answer came in the form of organized violence that quickly became known as the Second Intifada. What started as organized protests quickly became a sustained campaign of suicide bombs and other forms of deadly terrorism. 1,100 Israelis were murdered. One of them was Malki Roth, a 15-year-old girl, an Australian citizen and the daughter of our guest tonight, Arnold Roth. Since that time, Arnold and his wife have honoured Malki's memory by establishing Karen Malki and have fought for justice by attempting to have Malki's killer extradited to the US for her crimes. Arnold will be speaking about these still painful topics and more tonight with Emily Gian, the ZFA's Director of Communications. So without further ado, Em, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Bren. And Arnold, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. We really appreciate it. I thought I'd just start by asking, how are you? How's life now that we're both, I'm here in Melbourne, you're in Jerusalem, how's life in lockdown?
Well, it's very different from normal conditions and quite frightening. The numbers are not lost on people who listen to the news, and our numbers are really awful. It's hard to know how we're going to work our way out of this, but everyone has faith that we're going to. Many people think we've already worked our way out of it, and that's why we're in such deep trouble.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a mentality thing, I suppose, because I have family in Israel who after the first wave were like, yeah, it's over. It's like the war's over, it's done, but not the case. So I thought I'd start off by mentioning that I was chatting to my dad earlier about the fact that we're going to be talking today. And he mentioned that back now, I would say it was 50 years ago, the two of you were on the editorial board of a student newspaper, or a Jewish student magazine called Survival, which I have the first edition here. Wow. I'm holding a prop. I feel like Bibi at the UN or something, but I just thought it was fascinating. I've got a whole lot of issues here, and I feel like having read through all of the issues, it seems like firstly that a lot of issues repeat itself just with different players in terms of things you may have been dealing with student groups on campus, and just certain things within the Palestinian-Israeli, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, as it was called then. So I was just wondering whether these times in your student activism days is what led you to make Aliyah, or what took you to Israel? What takes a nice Melbourne boy to Israel?
Right. So as you might know, I'm not the only nice Melbourne boy living in Israel. And in fact, in the neighborhood in which we now live, in the southern half of Jerusalem, there are many Australian families. And in fact, it's very often the case that when I attend social gatherings, a majority of the people there were people who were either at school or in B'nai Akiva with me. And that's a very good feeling. Yeah. The passion to speak out on behalf of Israel has certainly been part of my life for a long time. The need to speak out is undoubted because of what you just said. Some of the same themes, and sometimes it's even more interesting to say very different themes, but coming from the same place. Terminology that you don't hear, binational secular democratic state, is almost never used anymore, but we were up against that a lot of the time. But the passions that lead to the clashes and to the exercises of futility and stupidity are still with us, more violent than they were back then.
Yeah.
And much more focused on ordinary people and not army to army, because it's evolved into something quite different in that sense.
Yeah, that's true. Which I suppose leads me to our discussion about, firstly, just starting off with, this week, as Bren mentioned, marks 20 years since the start of the Second Intifada, which, sadly you have a personal story about. Could you tell us a little bit about the mood in Israel, like at the outbreak of the Intifada, or the mood in Jerusalem?
I've lived in Jerusalem for almost 33 years, and there were lengthy periods of very serious terrorism well before the events of 20 years ago.
Yeah.
You'll find I'm quite reluctant to use the word intifada. I think there are lots of words that we use because everyone uses them, but that if you feel you have a stake, and I feel I have a stake,
Yeah.
you have a real reluctance to adopt them because they're dishonest. It was an awful time, starting with the first killings around Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and then the massacre at the Dolphinarium, which was really quite a turning point. That was, as I remember it, May or June of 2001. What I didn't know at the time, and had I known it, it probably would have changed the trajectory of my life, is that Malki was deeply distressed by it. She wrote about it in her diary. The killing of the kids standing outside a discotheque in the Dolphinarium building on the foreshore in Tel Aviv really got to her, because so many of them were young. They may not have been as young as she was, and they certainly lived different lives. It was a Friday night, for example, and we're Sabbath observers, but it reached her in ways that, I have to say, looking back, make me very proud. She had a total empathy and a total identity with other Jews, with other Israelis, with other people in general, especially, as you may know, with children with special needs. But what we didn't know was that she used to cry in private, and she would hide it even from her classmates, and not out of any fear, but out of a sense of what awful losses are being suffered by the Jewish people. But I only know this now, and she was 15 when she was writing these things. It reflects a depth of personality and of soul that I wish I would have understood better at the time.
Yeah, I suppose it's, really special that you have the journals to have that insight into things that she may not have shared otherwise. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about Malki, about what she was like?
She was popular. She had a lot of friends. She was very engaged with people at the expense of her school studies. She was a youth leader at the end. She was a youth leader when she was 15. But when she was 14, exactly a year before her life ended, this is, I think, the purest expression of what was going on in her soul. She told Fremit, my wife, that she felt that she'd learned so much from helping to care for Chaya, our youngest child, who's very disabled, one of the most disabled children I've ever seen. She's blind and she doesn't ever communicate, and she needs to be picked up, and there's nothing that she can do for herself. And Malki absorbed all of that, adored her, spent a lot of time caring for her, spent time in hospital with either Fremit or me, and decided these things that she wanted to share. And she went out onto the streets of the neighborhood where we then lived. We were there for 32 years. We moved a year ago, looking for somebody. And she really had no idea who she was looking for, who might need her. And she found a young mother whose husband had walked out as soon as it was clear that their child was born with congenital problems that were going to make his life end before he was 7 or 8. And she said, I would like to help you. And she spent the entire summer of that summer holiday being the mother's helper. And she would come back at night telling us about how little Ro'i had vomited all over the place. He's just so gorgeous. Stories like that, they sound comical, but they again gave us some insight even then, but now looking back, we see it in a different way, into what made her a special person. She just wanted to help. She was filled with love, filled with happiness, very optimistic person. And here I've just told you that she was crying privately, but it was coming from a place of real empathy and concern. She had a lot of sense of responsibility as well, and was desperate to get the privilege of becoming a youth leader in the Ezra youth organization, which doesn't exist in Australia, but is parallel to B'nai Akiva here, and had her own group of children. And again, the children, it's the interactions that Malki had. The children who are today adults, Malki would now be 35, have told us in visits over the years of how meaningful it was. They were almost all from the former Soviet Union. They were almost all in small families, usually one-parent families, and they were all in a neighborhood of Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim, which was really just getting to its feet at the time. And these kids faced enormous challenges, which 9-year-olds aren't all that well equipped to deal with. And Malki was the difference. That's what they say. Malki was the difference. She sat with them. She cared for them. She cared with them. And she helped them find themselves. And these are wonderful stories when they're told to you by people who have clearly pulled their lives together and are living essentially happy lives. That was what Malki did. She made people happy.
That's really special also to be able to hear the stories and to hear that she had such an impact on people. Now coming to the Sparrow bombing on obviously the day your life changed on the 9th of August. So how did that day play out for the Roth family?
Pretty badly. I was, as I usually was, out of the house pretty early in the morning, and Frimet has always been a night bird and uses the nights to care and provide therapies to our youngest. Was asleep when Malki came knocking on her bedroom door, and they had a brief exchange where Frimet says she didn't even open her eyes, said she's going out with Michal, girl from next door, very good friends with the family, and they were going to go off and do this, that, and the other. As Malki left, she said, "Love you," and that was the last exchange. What we know is that they went off to decorate the home of a friend who was coming back from summer holidays in the United States that day, and after that, they were going to go to a meeting of Madrichot and Madrichim of the Ezra Youth Group ahead of the summer camp. Just to remind everybody on this call, it's summer now. That's when summer is in this part of the world, June, July, August, September. And on the way, they decided to stop off in the center of town. They both liked going to Sparrow, and that's where they were. 2 o'clock, I got a call at place of my work. I was in running a drug company, and it was Frimet screaming. And she said there's been a pigua. She can't reach the children. And she hung up before I could even really get my thoughts together or say anything. And then I'm going to skip the next 12 hours. We didn't really know anything until 2 o'clock. I mean, we worked hard to try to learn things, but we learned nothing much until our sons, the 2 oldest boys, called from the pathology lab of the state of Israel in Abu, I'm blanking on the name, in Yafo, and said they'd found Malki. Until then, we really didn't know. After that, life is pretty much a blur. It was a blur for a long time. Yes, everything was really turned upside down, as anyone on the call would imagine. And in some ways, that process is ongoing. Of course, it's changed its nature totally. When it all began, it was a matter of something hideous has come down from heaven and it's taken our daughter, and we don't know why. And so many other people are in deep suffering, and everybody's around us and sympathizing. And here, there's lots of tears and emotional intensity. And today, we're not that far. We're not in a different century. And the fault lines in our lives have become quite different, because with the benefit of looking back, we now know precisely what happened that day. We know who did it and why. We know that it was all driven by a woman who had just arrived from Jordan. We now know that she arrived here because she had just had a pregnancy out of marriage and had given birth to the child, who was then left behind as she took off to her family connections, cousins, in a town not far from Jerusalem. Went to university, got recruited by Fatah, and then was recruited from Fatah into Hamas, and says that she did something wonderful. Fast forward until literally today, and she is a national hero in the one Arab country that most Western countries have terrific relations with, certainly Australia, as I am reminded afresh today as a result of quite unwelcome information given to me by people in the government of Australia. That government, Jordan, has turned her into a first-rate celebrity. They've given her freedom. They restrict her life? Not at all. They enabled her, and this is a country which has a totally restrictive media regime. It's a very cruel country, Jordan, contrary to probably everybody's expectations. They gave her a platform in which she presented her own TV show, made in Jordan, in Amman, in the capital, for 5 years between February 2012 and September 2016, where the entire purpose of it was terrorism. We are, of course, and I'm foreshadowing where you're going to take this, trying very hard to get this woman brought into custody in Jordan for the sole purpose.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go
so
ahead.
that we can take a step back for
Yeah.
some of our viewers who may not know. She actually, so we're talking about Tamimi, and she was captured a few weeks after the attack, and she went to jail in Israel. Yes?
Ahlam Tamimi was sentenced to 16 terms of life imprisonment on her own confession, never denied a thing.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, and I know this would be hard, confronting to talk about, but we've all probably seen the videos of her smiling in interviews while she's in prison, when she learned about how many children were killed, and she thought there were less, and there turned out to be more, and she was smiling like this isn't a woman that was in any way repentant then, now, or anything. So she was sentenced to 16 life terms, and you know, that I mean, nothing's ever going to obviously bring comfort, but the fact that she was in jail at that time would have been, you know, a very different feeling, I suppose, to now her being out. So in those years that she was in prison, you and your wife started your blog, The Ongoing War, and I just wanted to first sort of turn back to that for a second. What was the purpose at that time of your blog?
I can say that very simply.
Yeah.
It's called, by the way, This Ongoing War.
Yeah.
And we started it in 2006. And the reason we did was a sense, after having been in the crosshairs of the media at that point for 5 years, that there was either willful or just stupidity-based misunderstanding of what terrorism is about, what it does to Western society, what it does to the people who are directly affected. So we wrote about terrorism more or less in the abstract, but through the lens of people living in a society that just wants to get on with making the country as good as it can and making lives as productive as they can, and being interrupted in the most violent way by people who have profound, almost incomprehensible hatred on their minds. And that was how we got started, and that's pretty much where we were for a couple of years. It was actually very early in the piece that we became aware that there were serious efforts to have this woman released from prison, she specifically, and that there was no shortage of prominent Israeli figures who were quite happy about that process and even complicit in it. And we felt that this was so wrong, so incomprehensible, and so based on misunderstanding and even willful imposition of stupidity upon themselves, that we needed to speak. So that the direction both of our activism and of the things we wrote were, do you know who this woman is? Do you know why she's in prison? Stop talking about releasing her. She should never be released. And that went on for 5 years. And getting towards the end of those 5 years, we were well aware that there were powerful winds that were blowing in the direction of nothing will be right until Ahlam Tamimi and some others are released. That was a very bitter period in our lives. I don't want to say it was more bitter than what we're going through today, because we're going through a particularly bitter period today as well, but we're better equipped. But it was hard. It was hard to come to terms with. There were real efforts. Go ahead.
So was there a reason specifically, like her and a few other people, why they were specifically on some sort of a list to be released? We'll get to the Gilad Shalit deal in a minute, but just...
I'm going to ask you from deep cynicism. You can take people at face value when they say, well, she's a woman, first of all, and then she's really a political prisoner. You know, you've killed their children. You know, you can understand why, and it's that kind of logic. It's preposterous. There are all sorts of factual steps that people skip. There are logical steps that I think do no one any credit, and but then it became part of a larger process. The larger process, which sort of sanctified all of those mistakes was we must do everything we can to save Gilad Shalit. The Gilad Shalit cause was exceedingly popular, but it was misrepresented. It was marketed in ways that, in my opinion, do no honor to the people who were involved, other than the Shalit family, who, from my point of view, could have gone out there and slaughtered cats and dogs in order to draw attention to their cause. In a certain way, everything's legitimate if you're looking to save your child, but that doesn't explain why political leaders would allow themselves to be drawn into a process that, as predicted and as naturally happens, led to many more deaths after the Shalit deal was transacted. So, though I hope we won't end up speaking only about the Shalit deal here, it is absolutely right to focus on those moments, the 2 or 3 years leading up to the release of Gilad Shalit, in exchange for 1,027 Palestinian Arab terrorists, more than half of whom were actual murderers. I speak slowly about that because at no stage in that entire process were those facts ever communicated to the Israeli public. And I think you'll have a hard time even today. And anyone who wants to explore that should just make contact with me, and I'll share what I know, because I've got a table of every one of those people who were released. And I can tell you exactly what they did in order to get in there. And I can tell you exactly which of them were murderers.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a really difficult one. And having now read about your story, and also even just talking to you now, and I know at the time we understood that these terrorists had blood on their hands, and I must admit I was one of those people who campaigned heavily for Gilad's release, and obviously was happy when he was released, but I feel a sense of sadness, and I feel almost like I should apologize to you for being so delighted that he was released and not taking into consideration what it meant for him to be released, and what it meant to the families of all of the people that were affected by those that were released in that deal. So what I wanted to ask was, obviously I would assume that the victims of terror families, bereaved families, would have had contact with government officials over the years. Did they come to you before? Did they come to the families before and say, look, this is who's on the list? Or was there any sort of consideration taking in that sense to the families like yourself?
Allow me to say 2 things here. First of all, you've expressed what you were expressing about the ambivalence that you feel beautifully. And you certainly did nothing wrong. You did everything right. And I think there'd be something wrong with someone who did not celebrate the release of Gilad Shalit. On the other hand, our perspective was very different, because I think we knew things that other people didn't know. And we knew how dishonestly the whole campaign was being marketed. Yeah. And therefore, it's not that we had hesitations. We were furious. We were enraged. We were talking to political figures and having doors slammed in our faces. Now, the second part of what I wanted to say is essentially, I'm sorry, I can't say very much, meaning that there are things that I say in private gatherings, in gatherings with people in the world of philosophy and politics, which reflect a rather deeper and more analytical view of that whole Shalit, prisoner release, denial, concealment chapter in our lives. I think it's wrong for Israelis to talk about this publicly and out in the open. The issues are alive. The same political figures are active today, many of them, some of them, in precisely the same position that they were in at the time that the Shalit deal was done. And therefore, inevitably, and this is what I do not want to do, I would be taken as making some political statements. I'm not. What I can say is that it's been a natural process for us to, and I'll use the word sublimate, sort of convert the anger and the need to bring change from things that are really beyond our control. There's many things that are beyond our control. Most importantly, we know we're not bringing Malki back, into something I think no less constructive, but channeled in a direction that really no one else is going and that we need to go. And that is to bring that specific person, the woman who almost in a literal sense says, it was me, it was me. She read the news that night. She went straight from the scene of the bombing to Ramallah, where she read the news on a Palestinian television station called Al Istiqlal, starting with her report about what happened in Jerusalem. And that woman, who was not at all frank with you, Emily, when she said, how many children were killed there? Oh, Emily, I don't really know. Was it 3? Where the reality is that she knew precisely how many children she murdered. She had been tried and sentenced and had all the information that the prosecution had put in front of her. It's a nonsense what she managed to pull off. Everyone thinks that she didn't know and was surprised. She's not surprised in the slightest. She's a deeply cynical, manipulative person. So where we are today is that we can barely get the whole discussion going to the point where people are even ready to look at what she did. It's forgotten. She is now an honest-to-goodness celebrity in Jordan. She represents a whole set of Jordanian interests that are defended by His Majesty King Abdullah II, who is an honoured guest in Australia and whose government has close ties with Australia. This is, in my opinion, this is where we need to focus our energies, and indeed, that's what we've been doing since 2012, the first few weeks of 2012.
So she was released. She was released from the Israeli prison after the Shalit deal. She gets on a bus and goes straight to Jordan, and she
went to Cairo, where she had a one-on-one meeting with the head of Hamas, and then was sent as a VIP non-stop from Cairo to Amman, and was greeted there with a raucous welcome, and then a much more sedate welcome inside one of the royal courthouses in Amman. There was no doubt where she was going. She was being prepared to accept celebrityhood on her shoulders.
So she's in Jordan. So what made you decide to turn to the US? Like, what is the process that you then decided we'll turn to the US and see if we can seek justice there?
Right. Now, you've promised me that we have 3.5 hours for this show, so I'm going to do it step by step. Oh, no? Okay, so let me tell the short version. 2 things. The first is that...
We've got...
What have we got?
We've got time.
You know that I was kidding. I'm going to be very short. The first thing was seeing in February 2012 that she was given a TV show called Breezes of the Free, given by the people who were and are her employers and her ideological masters, the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan and Hamas. The notion of putting together a TV show might sound like a sort of a primitive slapdash undertaking. It wasn't from the beginning, and it certainly wasn't once it got into its stride. It had high production values. It was beamed all over the western suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne and every other part of the world where there are large groups of Arabic-speaking people, and it was hugely influential. You might ask yourselves, well, why have I never heard about this? And I would say to you, pretty good question. Let's think about it, but I'm not going to discuss it now. So she got her own TV show. I already knew enough at that stage. I know much more today. I'm not boasting. I'm just saying I've had time to dwell on this, just how cruel Jordanian society is. There's so much about Jordan that I wish I could share here, but the danger of doing that is that you come across at a certain point as being a kind of a foaming at the mouth nutcase. I'm not interested in changing people's views of Jordan, except to the extent that they recognize that Jordan is getting away with something extremely ugly, that's 1, and extremely dangerous, that's 2. She's a very dangerous person. She's the most wanted, I'm getting ahead of myself, the most wanted female fugitive alive in the world today. So once she was given this TV show, I then started doing what comes naturally to me. I'm no longer a lawyer, I don't practice law today, but I looked into the law and discovered that because of Frimet being an American and the fact that we took the trouble to have all of our children get American citizenship when they were born in Australia and then in Israel as well. The 3 children born after Malki, our 3 daughters, our only 3 daughters today, all have American citizenship. I discovered that there's a law that's never been applied to any case here in Israel, and that is that under American law, if there's an act of terrorism that takes place not on American soil involving American victims, then the American government reserves to itself something that I don't think any other government in the world even tries to do, which is the right, the privilege, and the obligation to go after the terrorist on American terms bring the terrorist to the physical premises of the United States and put that terrorist on trial under United States law. That sounded to me like a really good kind of thing for us to go after. And then I discovered that it had never once been applied to a single one of the many murders of American Jews at the hands of Palestinian Arabs. And I had to ask myself, why is that? Well, I don't really have an answer, but I can tell you that in the middle of, I think it was February, it might have been the end of February or the beginning of March, I put myself on a plane to Washington. I became married to a fine American lawyer who's still one of the closest and dearest influences on my life now. He's been in the picture the entire time, a wonderful man. And we went to see the Justice Department in Washington, and we had a really intense meeting there with a large group of investigators and prosecutors and FBI agents. And we came away from there with this ringing undertaking, which was, if we can help you, if we can bring this woman into custody, we will. But we won't be able to tell you anything about what's going on. And as I've said in a lot of more light-hearted moments, I came home telling Frimit that we were in for a hard few weeks because they weren't going to be able to tell us until they, completed all their work. And 5 years later, we got a phone call from them. We're going to come to Jerusalem. We're going to be there in 3 weeks' time. Could you meet us? And that's how we ended up sitting with one other family, the family of the other American woman, American national woman who was here as a tourist, who was murdered, with a group of lawyers and investigators and FBI agents from the Department of Justice. And they said to us that we are actually pleased to tell you that we have an indictment against her, which has been hanging around for the last 4 years. Breathtaking. But we're announcing it in Washington 3 hours from now. This was because of the time difference, the evening here in Jerusalem. The announcement was made in Washington later that afternoon. And they told us that they'd asked the Jordanians to hand her over under the extradition agreement, which we had known about for years. Extradition means that one country says to another country, you're holding somebody that we want to put on trial. The treaty says hand her over. Please hand her over. We'd like her to be on the 4 o'clock plane. That's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, we have a similar situation here at the moment with someone we'd like to extradite from Israel.
I know. In our case, they already signaled to us that the Jordanians had been saying no for years. We didn't even know there were charges, and they'd already been saying no. Well, at that point, it was suggested to us that you're in the court of public opinion now, Mr. Roth, and you ought to push as hard as you can. And that's what we've been doing from February or March of 2017. March of 2017, we have been really quite intensively engaged in trying to change public opinion in the United States, try to get the necessary political resolve and get the Jordanian government to understand very clearly what its obligation is and extradite this woman. And just before I surrender back to you, just one statement about the Jordanians. Everything they say about why they are not extraditing Ahlam Tamimi from Jordan is a total fabrication. There's no truth. There are no facts to support them. They make it all up and they avoid having to discuss this in the media. The only public statements that have been made have been those statements that were made in the afternoon of a court hearing that took place 6 days after that discussion that I've just mentioned between us and the American lawyers and the investigators and FBI agents who came here. 6 days later, the High Court of Jordan, it's called the Court of Cassation, handed down a ruling, a bizarre ruling, which in effect says we don't have to hand her over. Not only do we not have to hand her over, but the whole extradition agreement that we signed with the Clinton administration in 1995, it's invalid.
And why do they say it's invalid?
Pay attention, ladies and gentlemen. On one basis only. They say, and I pay attention, ladies and gentlemen. I'm saying it that way. I'm trying not to come across like a clown because there are so many explanations that are given in the media, especially by Arabs who are accepted in the West, and it's all made up. The only grounds that the court found were that under the Jordanian constitution, a treaty has to get the approval of the parliament. It has to be ratified. That's the key word. And they say it wasn't. So I could literally spend the next half hour going through a list of why all of that is rubbish. I'll just confine myself to one point, which is the State Department, under prolonged siege by Frimmett and me, eventually told us on the record, well, actually in 1995, when the treaty was signed, they handed us the instruments of ratification, which you would think would end the issue. But as soon as I did some thinking and had the wit to say, okay, send it to us, at that point, we were told, no, you have to make an application under the Freedom of Information Act, and then we'll be glad to hand it over. The current delay with Freedom of Information Act in the applications in the United States is between 1.5 and 3 years. And we made this request a year ago. So everybody in this little charade, I shouldn't use that word, all the very serious diplomats and political appointees and officials in the government of the United States are absolutely aware that the Jordanians are engaging in a little bit of having a lend of you, to use an expression that we know in Australia. They're having a lend of the whole world, and no one takes them seriously. And that's when I have to come to the point that everybody, I think, in this call realizes it's really all politics. It's not about justice. It's not about talking straight. It's the exact opposite. It's about double talk and open hypocrisy and doing things that everybody knows are wrong, but without facing up to the consequences. And my job, almost like a school teacher, which I'm not, I'm a retired lawyer who's been deeply involved in Israel's technology business now since we made Aliyah, have become a school teacher. At least that's how it feels. I try to get students, which means Israeli politicians and American politicians and so on, and media people, to just stand still for long enough so that I can say to them, do you know what jackasses you're being played for by the Jordanians? Do you know how much harm is being done to justice, to the lives of innocent people, to the mindset and emotional well-being of people not only like Frimmett and me, but also like Frimmett and me, who are being cheated of seeing justice done to an especially cruel person who not for one moment has expressed regret over the murders that she carried out. On the contrary, thinks that it was wonderful and encourages everybody else to go out and do the same thing.
And what do the students, politicians, say when you confront them with that?
I need you, Emily. I really need you. You're asking exactly the kind of questions that I wish everybody would ask themselves. Look, an honest answer, without revealing too much, I'll say I'm in discussions with quite a number of Australian figures at this point. And as it happens, I had an exchange this morning in writing with the chief staff person, with let's call it a prominent Australian politician, who says, I won't finish the thought. I'll just say this. Either people don't understand the issues or they want you to think they don't understand the issues. It's extremely frustrating. I'm dealing with some of the smartest people around, and I'm having conversations where I literally pinch myself. Is this happening? Is this real? I've been going through that process for 20 years, 19 years, asking myself, do they understand what they've just said? But the truth is that when you're just Frimmett and Arnold, and when your cause is just justice for a murdered child who almost nobody alive today remembers, understands what the loss amounts to in our lives, it's very difficult to even have a serious discussion with them, because from their perspective, and I understand the realpolitik of this very well, they're saying, what do you want from us? People are killed all the time. People die of AIDS and they die of COVID and they get run over. Why are you making a big deal? Or as a famous Australian radio journalist said, not to me, but to a close friend of mine in Melbourne, why don't you get a life? And I'm answering him now when I say this, Emily, and I'm sorry to be talking over your shoulder. Looking for justice is something that really makes a lot of sense to my wife and me at this point. And it isn't vengeance. It's certainly not about bringing Malki back to life. And it isn't just about Malki. But because it's Malki, and because losing a child is one of the most difficult processes in biological terms that any human being, probably any animal, ever goes through, it amounts to a powerful motivator to go and do something that will move the needle. That's the American expression, move the needle, make a change. Do something where people will come along afterwards and say, oh, it wasn't always like that. We're in a different place. Not allowing justice, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I think it's actually horrendous for anybody that hasn't been in that situation. And, thank goodness I haven't been in that situation, but I think it's horrendous for anyone that hasn't been in that situation to have the nerve to say, find something else, do something else. I think that, what you're doing, even if it is successful and, if it even stops one more person in Jordan or in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip from thinking that they can do something like that and then get away with it, and not just get away with it but be treated as a hero or as a celebrity in Jordan and in whichever other countries, then I think that you've done your job, and kol hakavod to you and your wife.
I can't say that I don't like to hear this, but I want to say it back to you a little differently.
Yeah.
What we really are driven by, it wasn't obvious to us at the beginning, but it is obvious to us now, is the sense that because she's gotten away with it, not only gotten away with it, but gotten away with it by persuading the royal family, which owns Jordan and runs Jordan, to stand up against their by far most important ally and take enormous risks. Jordan is Jordan is a recipient of foreign aid from the United States, making the United States its most important source of income. And Jordan is the third largest recipient of US aid in the world, a tiny country, but there you have it. And the impact of the Tamimi affair, which is absolutely not understood outside the region, but is very well understood in the Arab world, is that if you're driven by a holy enough cause, which has the buy-in of the entire population from top to bottom and from left to right, then you will be able to do things that are miraculous. What this woman did was blessed by God. She said it herself. What she did in killing those children, she went out looking for children. Most of her victims were children, and the place was chosen because of the children that were there. She was blessed by God, who not only enabled her to succeed, but also enabled the Zionists to understand that they really need to release her and send her back to Jordan, where she will become famous for what she did. The impact of that is enormous. And I don't understand why more people don't do what I do, which is beat up on the ambassadors of Jordan around the world and say to them, speak. We can't reach your king. We can't reach your prime minister or president. I can't even reach your ambassadors. They all ignore me. I don't understand why other people aren't doing really exactly that. And nor am I asking for it now. But I'll tell you what I do ask for every time I speak publicly. I make the assumption that I'm talking to Americans, and I know, Emily, that not everybody in this call is an American. But everybody knows Americans, and Australia has a big role to play in this. Go talk to your politicians, have them speak up. That request in the United States has real resonance, because what I'm asking them to do is to have the legislative branch of the United States government make it clear to the executive branch of the United States government that what it's doing is not enough. The fact is that the United States has never read the Riot Act to Jordan. I'm not going to go into a deeper analysis on that. I can only say that there's a lot of movement. We've been working on this really intensively for quite a long time. And while most of the focus is in the Congress and on the White House and on the State Department, there's a lot that can be done in Australia for the simple reason that Jordanians see Australia as perhaps their closest friend outside the Arab world. And if we could have a clear, ethical, moral voice emanating from Australia, directed at their dear friends the Jordanians, saying, this is appalling. You're doing some great harm to the moral fabric of your own country. Don't do this. Hand her over. That's where she should be. And that's before I get into any arguments of, do you realize what an absurd argument? There's no argument. There is no argument on the Jordanian side. They're doing what they're doing, holding her and making her a celebrity because no one is attacking them. No one is asking them the hard questions. There hasn't been a single media person in any country in the world who has confronted anybody from Jordan on this issue and said, how do you dare to do this? And as much as I love to hear people saying, good on you, we've really failed. At this level, we've really failed. We haven't given up, and we're certainly intending to win. But on this issue, it has to be said, we've failed. Where is the moral outrage of people? Not over Malki, but over this embrace of terrorism, of the murder of Jews as an end in itself. And one final word before I really do what I said I was going to do and just give it back to you. I'm sorry, Emily. Is we know why Tamimi did this. She made it clear. She has said it on TV. She's repeated it again and again. She's a media personality. She knows how to express herself. She says, because the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews is a religious conflict. Did I forget to mention the Green Line and occupied territories? Well, she did too, because it actually is not part of her calculus. And I can't emphasize that enough. What we're talking about here is something primitive that is being sanctified by the inaction of people in the West and the action of the authorities in Jordan, and for that matter, in other parts of the Arab world.
And, you know, you talked about Australia, and obviously you're an Australian citizen, and Malki was an Australian citizen. So what could Australians do? Would it be just contacting their local member, or is there something else that people watching could do?
That would be enough. Contacting local members, contacting senators, and contacting the Prime Minister with the goal of being politely persistent in saying it is really offensive to all of our values that the murderer of this Jewish girl from Australia has gone scot-free and is living as a celebrity in a country with which Australia has terrific relations. I could go further, but we'll avoid descending into the details and tell you about the Jordan Media Institute, which is the Arab world's best school for journalism, created in Jordan by the king's step-sister-in-law, half-sister-in-law, who used to be a personality on CNN, where it aspires to create, in a country that has a controlled media, to create world-class journalists. Some years ago, the student body there declared Ahlam Tamimi to be their success model. I wrote to every embassy that was providing funding to the Jordan Media Institute, and I got a third of them to cut their funding immediately. One of them was not Australia. The Australian ambassador ducked, ran for cover, referred the matter on to DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I have to say, I was left, without going into the details, extremely disappointed with the double talk and the failure to address what I think are very clear ethical issues. So this is a way of underscoring that Australia has a voice. Australians are the most decent people on earth, and Australia's ethical outrage ought to be heard. Australian leaders, Australian Jewish leaders, Australian political leaders will find the right way to express that. But, you know, getting the support of the grassroots, which are the people in our audience here today, would be invaluable.
Yeah. Arnold, we have a few questions. I have some other questions I wanted to ask you, but we had a few questions on the Zoom webinar here, and one of them was, to what extent do you feel let down by Israel? But I feel like you may have touched on that earlier, unless there's anything else you wanted to
Right,
add.
I'll do my little acrobatic performance. On one hand, I'm never going to publicly criticize the state of Israel. On the other hand, the Times of Israel, under the editorship of a remarkable journalist, David Horowitz, wrote an epic piece. I think he said the longest article he's ever written, 14,000 words, after 2 meetings that he had with us several months ago. And it starts out by saying, the headline, after being let down by Israel, parents of the terror victim are looking for the United States, etc. I'm going to leave it pretty much at that level. I would urge whoever's interested to really explore this, because it's not that I'm lacking any issues that I want to challenge people with. Believe me, I've got them up the wazoo. But I won't use a public platform like this to express them. But at our blog, This Ongoing War, if you type in those 3 words as if they were one word in Google, you'll come to us. You'll see a lot of the agonies that we go through in trying to come to terms with this. We are passionate Zionists. I've used the word passionate too many times in this call, but we really are Zionists.
No, of course.
We've never regretted for a day bringing our family here. Coming to Israel was a decision that both of us made with open eyes, even before we got married, and it's worked out wonderfully. Our children have terrific lives. Our grandchildren are just wonderful young Israelis, and it's not about that. But it is about politics, and it is about politicians. And don't get me going, because I could really look like I'm a foaming at the mouth nutcase when I talk about the way politicians use double talk and avoid the issues in order to dress up an issue which at heart is a matter of either self-interest or other interests.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's okay to feel let down by a system or a certain, you know, by something, and still feel, you know, passionate about the place where you live. And I feel like, you know, that there's got to be a little bit of nuance in understanding that even if you feel let down by that decision, it doesn't mean that you feel let down by Israel entirely. Otherwise, you'd join us back here in Australia in a slightly less lockdown.
In a totally non-lighthearted way, I have to say, thank you. Yes, you've expressed that well.
Thank you. So the other question, which I think you may have also touched on before, but was what do you think that Jordan's reason is for not wanting to release Amini?
Oh, that's pretty simple. Jordan has a population that is at least 80% Palestinian Arab. They don't identify themselves as Jordanians without adding on the Palestinian Arab qualifier. The king is married to a Palestinian Arab woman for that reason. And I could take the discussion a lot further in the direction that people in Australia in particular are quite familiar with, by looking at the history of Jordan. How did Transjordan become Jordan, and how did the British Mandate become Transjordan? I'm not seeking to do that. It's enough if I simply draw everybody's attention to the fact that the king is a non-Jordanian. His family's roots are in the Arabian Peninsula. They lost out to the Saudis in the period immediately after World War I, and he doesn't want to die. And it's really enough if I sort of cut it off at that point. The one thing that I would emphasize is there's no explanation that does anybody any credit at all. It's disgraceful. It may not be the only disgraceful thing going on in Jordan or in the life of King Abdullah, but it is totally disgraceful. And in the end, it is causing enormous damage to the fabric of that country. And what the future holds for Jordan is really an open issue.
Yeah, well, I really hope that, you know, this gets somewhere, and, you know, obviously we'll all keep doing what we can from here and keep following what's going on in the States from there. We don't have much time, so I actually just wanted to go back a little bit and talk about the Malki Foundation, and sort of what it is and why you decided to start it up.
The Malki Foundation is now 19 years old. It was the papers of registration came out on the morning of 9/11 in 2001. Of course, it didn't have that resonance then, but it very quickly did. The Malki Foundation is a reflection of the life and values of Malki. She was engaged in doing good for children with special needs, certainly in our own family. She was her little sister's best friend, but she was also deeply involved with other people, not just the single mother that I mentioned earlier, but with children with special needs who will be mainstreamed in her school and in lots of other ways. She was remarkable. When we decided that we needed to do something that would cause people to remember Malki, I remember using the expression, we don't want her to become a statistic. But I now realize that what was really lurking at the back of my mind was, I want us to have an organization where I can get up in front of people and say, there was a Malki, and then speak for a few minutes about the precious life of this very special young woman. But at a different level, chesed, the act of doing good for other people, has always been a Jewish value which does the most good for the people who are doing it. When you're engaged in helping out other people, and in our case, we make a point of underlining how it isn't just Jews, it's anybody here in the territory in which we live. It's Jews, it's Christians, it's Muslims, it's Druze, and it has involved, when the opportunities have presented themselves, Arabs living under the occupation of the Fatah and Hamas regimes. It's not at all political. And what we do is really terrific work. What we do is done by nobody else in this country. We provide equipment for enabling a child to be kept at home when the child has long-term chronic special needs. We fund therapies of a non-medical nature, physical therapy, horse therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and water therapy, which are always therapies that have been refused by the medical system. And we've funded upwards of 50,000 such therapies. We're a major provider of the means to enable those therapies to happen. And in the third program of ours, enabled by an Australian family quite some years ago now, we send our own employed therapists out into the far north and far south of Israel, where there is a chronic unavailability of therapists in the three fields: speech, occupational, and physio, and deliver therapies in the home, where in many cases the child, after being discharged from hospital, has never seen a therapist, sometimes for years, because of the bad planning that has led to terrible situation for families with children with special needs in the periphery. Those are the three things that it does, and I'm proud to say that the organization, which has never really grown as large as we think it ought to be, has been sustained by many thousands of donors in the English-speaking world. That's where we've always placed our focus. The Israeli side is growing dramatically now. We've just had the pleasure of welcoming a number of Hebrew-speaking Israelis onto the board, and that's already paying significant dividends. But up until now, most of our fundraising has been, first of all, in Australia, and then in the United Kingdom and the United States. The fact that we don't have too many gillionaires providing support means that we've always had both the obligation and the pleasure of reaching out to lots of ordinary people. And for those of you out there who are supporters of the Malki Foundation's work and you're ordinary, so you should just know you're not ordinary in our eyes, and we thank you, and I can say from the bottom of my heart, for your ongoing faith and staying with us. We really do, we, the management team of the organization, I'm the honorary chair, and the head of it is Debbie Yotkovich Fishman, who grew up in Melbourne. The work that's done by the Malki Foundation is not duplicated by anybody else. It's a model that is emulated and admired from afar. And in the end, when we win, we'll change the way the government of Israel deals with the children with special needs that it's supposed to be providing for, and unfortunately doesn't do a terrific job.
Oh, well, that's what I was going to ask. Do you receive any sort of funding from the government, or is it all private?
Well, for years we got none. Even today, it's a bit of a battle. But yes, we do have we have funding support from the Ministry of Welfare. It's a big discussion. I'm not going to get drawn into it. We ought to be, people ought to come to our office every morning and say thank you, but they don't. The government. And so we just get on quietly with what we need to do. In the end, relying on Jewish goodwill, and not only Jewish, but you know, the goodwill of people who understand that people with disadvantages in life are there as a challenge for the rest of us, and wanting to help us is a way of helping us want to help them. And there's nothing more noble, especially in Jewish life, and the word chesed really captures it very well.
And has the COVID crisis harmed the work in any way, or has it sort of hindered the help that people have been able to get in the home? Or
it's certainly had a very dampening effect on everybody. I have to say that because our model is the right word. The set of assumptions that we make is that we are empowering families who are being disempowered by the establishment. The families who make the decision, and I should have mentioned this earlier, made the decision to keep a child with special needs in their home and not hand it off to an institution. And I make the point that there are institutions in Israel who raise money in Melbourne, and people should really ask tough questions about the people who come with a handout looking for funding for institutions in Israel. The only solution that is sustainable, that really makes sense in terms of the fabric of the family, is to support the family. And our focus is only on supporting the family. So because we're working with families, the fact that clinics have shut down, hospitals have reduced their intakes, has meant that the families continue and get support from us so that they can give therapies in the home. Other than when the law prevents it, we continue to send our therapists on wheels into the families in the far north and the far south. And yes, thank God, the model has proven itself, and we're doing good work even though this pandemic is here. Now, I just want to mention one other thing that you haven't asked me about, but I saw somebody did, and it just flashed across my screen. There is a recent development. Ahlam Tamimi, if you want to find her on Facebook, made a speech on the 11th of September of this year, a big speech in a seminar commemorating, celebrating what happened on 9/11. Celebrating, that's the word. It was recorded in Jordan and is being beamed all through the world by Facebook. And the message is laid out in English on our blog. Go to This Ongoing War and you'll see a fairly lengthy article that I wrote about what Tamimi is saying. For the last 2 weeks, we have been speaking directly to Facebook and to the Department of Justice in the United States, asking that Facebook take this speech down. It breaches the American federal law, and it's disgusting. And it's still there. It's still there as of 5 minutes before I came onto our program here. We've now retained lawyers. A letter of demand is going out later today, I hope. And people ought to know that Facebook is has the potential to enable some of the ugliest values that are known to mankind to take root in places that you never think about, all in the name of free speech and social media and an open channel. It's a really hideous thing. And if we can send the management of Facebook, excuse the expression, to jail, that's okay.
You know, I could really talk to you for about 4 hours about the vile things that go on Facebook and how we're trying every single day to bring it all down, but it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, Arnold, we have run out of time. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you tonight, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. I know it's not an easy subject to talk about, but I think it's an important one, and I think that the fact that all the people watching have been able to hear about the beautiful things that Malki did in her short lifetime is really something special. And I really appreciate you talking about that with us today. So thank you.
I thank you so much, Emily, for creating this, and Brent for helping to facilitate it, and to the Zionist Federation, whose support we don't take for granted and appreciate very much.
Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Bren.
Thank you, Em, and thank you, Arnold. Look, Em, you wrapped it up much better than I could. Arnold, your message is articulate, it's passionate, and it's eloquent, and your message is powerful. And I strongly believe it has resonated among those of our listeners who had not heard your story before. And I'm confident people, and I encourage people to take up a pen and start asking questions of their local MPs, because that is the way to effect change. Thank you both for your time, and I'll leave it there. Hugs and Meg to you both and to everyone listening.
Thank you to everybody.